Okay, welcome everybody. This is going to be coverage of the first chapter in the textbook, where we're going to introduce the problem of drugs, particularly in the United States context. Later on, we'll broaden that and look at the drug problem in other countries, around the world as well. Now, let me give you just a bit of advice, word of advice, before we jump in to the lecture notes, and that is how to prepare for the quizzes in this class. If you've gone over the syllabus or the video course overview, you know that you have a quiz basically every week in this class where you get quizzed on usually one chapter that was presented the week before you take the quiz. And so a little bit of advice on how do you study for that? How do you take notes, or what are the important things to be able to do well on the quizzes? Well, the way I test, and this is true in basically all of my courses, so you should already be familiar with this if you've taken classes with me before, is that these quizzes are a combination of true, false, and multiple choice questions, and that I like to test on things that are easy to study, or that are sort of easy to target for study. So what you should be looking for in particular as you're going through the textbook chapters, and as you're listening to video lecture, is a great priority is to make sure and know the key terms from each chapter. And a good way to know the key terms is to study them in the glossary at the end of the textbook. Look up the key terms, see what the glossary, how it defines them. Maybe compare that with how I'm defining them in the lectures. I will choose those key terms that I think are most important. That's a high priority because I test heavily on that, and the reason why I do is that it's just good material to test you on, because you know that it's a very concrete thing to study. So it helps you know what to focus on in particular, what to prioritize your studying. And also the key terms always in a very short way, very brief way, contain a certain knowledge, specialized knowledge, in this case of dealing with drugs. And so they're just, when you learn the key terms and get familiar with those, you even though it's not that much work, you already understand quite a bit more about drugs just from knowing the key terms. So I test those heavily. I also test items that I stress a lot. If I lecture and I'm spending a lot of time on something, you're probably going to see quite a few quiz questions on the items that I'm focusing on a lot, because again, I'm focusing a lot on them a lot because I think they're important. So stress those both, and the lecture helps. The video recordings help you to learn what's most important, because a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm drawing out of the chapters the things I really want to stress and putting them into the lectures. And so that's right there is kind of telling you that to some extent what's important. Now there'll still be items that I'll test straight out of the textbook, because I can't cover everything in a lecture. But what you really need to look for in the textbook itself is key terms or things that are really stressed a lot, because the chapter considered the author considered those to be important to stress. And so, you should look for those sort of things. Don't stress too much about, if I stress statistics in the lectures, you need to be familiar with those. I try not to over-test or ask for, specific numbers, the exact percentage of this or that. But you do need to, the statistics are about kind of, facts about kind of solid things. So I do like to test on those. But I test you more for not do you know the exact number, but approximately whether there's a lot of this thing or a little of this thing, whatever it is we're talking about. So the stats, especially those that I go over a lot in the lectures, be familiar with not the exact number, but ballpark in the areas you should know. It's just something I know everybody has different philosophies about numbers and stats and stuff, but we're talking about facts which are just basic things you should be pulling out of a class like this. Okay, enough of the introduction here. Let's jump in to some of the subject matter. This opening chapter, as I said before, is kind of getting into the scope, the sort of the size of the drug problem. Not all areas, but at least things like drug use abuse, deaths from from overdosing. So some of these sort of big picture questions. So let's go through these. This first highlight here. The textbook now indicates that 72,000 drug overdoses occurred in the United States in 2017. Textbooks are always, unfortunately, even new textbooks have information that's not brand new, because stats are always kind of behind the times a little bit. They take a while to get together, and by the time they get published and they make their way into a textbook, they're already kind of old a little bit. So bear with me on that. It's just the problem with the issue of statistics. I went and looked up, okay, what's the reality closer to where we're at currently? And still, it's hard to get like cutting edge last minute stuff because these things are slow. But anyway, I think it's the trend here that's important. Look how much deaths due to drug overdoses have increased in the past half decade or so, from 72,000 deaths since 2017 up to over 110,000 in 2023. And the preliminary numbers I've seen for 2023 are even higher. So it just keeps going up, and it goes up dramatically, the number of people dying from drug overdoses. Since 2000, so we're talking a couple of decades plus here, the increase has gone up by a factor of 5, meaning the number of deaths now is, like, roughly speaking, 5 times the number of people who are dying now compared to back in 2000. So that is just an enormous explosion of death due to drugs, to drug abuse. And it's a serious problem, and I got to tell you, as a professor, it's one that was ignored and not recognized for years. It's only been the past 5 years or so that people have that the public, that the leaders of the country even recognize that it's a problem. It was flying under the radar for years, the increase in deaths due to drug overdoses. So it's a epidemic that the country should be embarrassed about, that we weren't even recognizing the size of the problem, even 5 years ago. It basically was flying under the radar for a decade at least. That's concerning. That's not good when we're missing things, big problems like that are happening all around us. In 2017, 49,000 drug overdose deaths involved an opioid drug, meaning when we say opioids, we'll talk about types of drugs later on, but here we're talking about heroin, prescription opioids, or synthetic, meaning opioids that are man-made, that are lab-made, as opposed to occurring naturally in plants. By 2021, opioids were involved in over 80,000 deaths. Close to 90% of these deaths are synthetic opioids, so the lab opioids. And we'll use this term fentanyl a lot in this course this semester, because that is doing an awful lot of the killing nowadays, and that's a type of synthetic opioid. So major problem. That's a lot of the majority, the vast bulk of these deaths the past few years have been due to these synthetic opioids, especially fentanyl. Drug overdose deaths involving stimulants. Now, opioids, fentanyl, they slow down your system. They're downers. They can kill you because they basically shut down your system. But people also die from uppers, from stimulants, drugs that crank up your system. And examples of those, cocaine. Cocaine deaths went from 5,000 in 2014 all the way up to 25,000. So that's like 5 times the number in only just a few years in 2021. So if we're talking about the drug meth, which is also a stimulant, The rise was from 6,000 to 15,000 over the same period of time. So we're talking doublings, we're talking triple, quadruple, 5 times as many, huge increases. And it's not only just fentanyl or these synthetic opioids, it's stimulants like cocaine and meth as well. Now, when you see these numbers, they're so abstract and seem so almost removed from reality. I mean, what does it mean to have, over 100,000 people dying from drug overdoses? I mean, that's almost like it's hard to wrap your mind around it. So to get concrete, one way to get concrete is compare it to some other social problem that we have where there's a lot of deaths. If you're, young people, most of you who are listening to this are fairly young, and the number one way that people your age die, if we're speaking generally, is due to automobile accidents. That's the traditional number one killer of young people, generally speaking. And yet, in 2022, the number of people who died from automobile accidents was 43,000 people. And again, if we jump back up to our first point, 110,000 in 2022 died from drug overdoses. So now, currently, deaths due to drugs is a much bigger number than deaths due to automobile accidents. So there's some context there. Everybody's always thought that too many people are dying from automobile accidents per year, especially young people, and it's been eclipsed and passed up significantly by the drug problem, the drug overdose problem. Another way to make it concrete too is this 110,000 people dying in 2022 from drug overdoses. 110,000. How many people are let's keep it to the Pocatello campus. Pocatello and surrounding area, there's not even 100,000 people in Pocatello, Chubbuck, surrounding area. So imagine a city significantly bigger than Pocatello being completely wiped out. The whole entire city, a lot bigger than Pocatello, being wiped out each year. That's what drugs are doing to people in the United States. So that, again, is kind of a concrete way to show the seriousness of the problem. Here you see, I like to show a lot of graphics in class because they're kind of a powerful way to simplify what we're talking about. As they say, if you can get a picture, it says 1,000 words, right? So looking at this graph here that goes through 2021 and all the way back to 1999, you can see the number of people in the country, national level, who die due to drug abuse. And it's all ages by gender as well. So it's got the total. The blue bars there show the totals. And by 2021, you can see almost 107,000 people dying from drug overdoses in the country. And that's compared to, if you go back to 1999 at the beginning of this series here, it's less than 20,000. That's still a problem, but less than 20,000 is a tiny fraction of 107,000 that we saw in 2021. Now let's look at male versus female. The female, which is the more, what color is that? An orangish color. You can see increases there over this period of time, this couple of decades plus, especially in the past, just say, 3 years. You can see significant increase, but look at how there has not been as much of an increase in female deaths as there have been with male deaths. Males are illustrated with the yellow line, and you can see how it's gone up steeper. It's significantly higher than females all the way back to 1999, but the gap grows in the past, say, decade plus. The gap has grown, and the rise is steeper for the guys versus the women. And so this epidemic has hit everybody, but it's hit males particularly hard. And this is an example, a really good example of where a person becomes a criminologist, where you see a pattern like this. You see, wow, not only increases in the past several years, big increases, But this growing gap between males and females, that it's been higher for males versus females going back quite a bit. But the gap has even grown over the past, decade plus. And by the way, these numbers keep going up in 2022, and preliminary numbers in 2023, they just keep going up. So the criminologist, you have to ask yourself, why is this more of a male problem than it is a female problem? That is a pattern which demands an answer and helps us to develop explanations for what's behind this problem and what's behind the increase. What is going on here? Why is it affecting men more, and that gap has been growing? There's something going on where gender is relevant. Now, I'm not going to, give you an answer right here. I don't know for 100% sure what the answer is, but let me pose you that as a question for your own contemplation. Why the gender difference? Why the gender difference? Why is it affecting men significantly more than females? That's an interesting question. Think on that. See if you can come up with an answer. Let's see. Let's go ahead. I like to try to keep these videos on the shorter side if I can. Let's break here, and we'll be able to cover more ground in segment number 2.